And let's go in depth now with Khalid El-Gindi. He's a former advisor to the Palestinian Authority leadership on negotiations with Israel. He's now with the Brookings Institution in Washington. Khalid, thanks very much for joining us. So how strong is Hamas right now?
It's actually quite weak. Hamas is in one of the weakest positions that it's been in many, many years. The changes that have happened in the region, and especially in Egypt, the closure of the tunnels and its access to finances and weapons have been severely diminished over the last year in particular. So they're in a much weaker position, and I think part of the motivation for sort of taking the Israeli bait, if you will, in this latest round of violence has been, I think, the fact that they're in a state of disarray, and it's in a way, I think, an act of desperation by a very weak Hamas.
Where are they getting their support? Because some of these missiles are pretty sophisticated.
Yeah, I mean, they have been stockpiling these weapons for a long time. So even the disruption of the flow of weapons, I think it doesn't take away from their existing cache. I mean, they have quite a substantive stockpile. So right now, I think they're clearly drawing on that. I think it's very hard for almost anything to get in and out of Gaza. So they're almost, I would say, basically reached their capacity as far as being able to arm themselves. But at the end of the day, whatever Hamas has in terms of arms is minuscule in comparison to the massive Israeli military force that Israel brings to bear.
Walk us through what would happen in Gaza, in the broader Palestinian community, in the Arab and Muslim world, if Israel were, as I suspect they will, move ground troops, tanks, armored personnel carriers into Gaza in the next day or two.
Well, I think you're likely to see, public opinion be sort of, you'll see a lot of outrage in the Arab street, although perhaps not as much as in the past, given the many other crises happening in the region. The Egyptians are distracted. Obviously, the Syrians and Iraqis, sort of major powers in the region, are distracted with their own internal problems, as well as citizens in those countries. But I think a ground incursion certainly would inflict more casualties, is likely to inflame Arab public opinion, especially if it's a prolonged conflict. It's also more likely to inflict Israeli casualties than obviously simply bombing from the air.
That's another excellent point. And as you point out, Egypt was able, the U.S. in the background, to broker a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas back, at the end of 2012. But Egypt's sort of staying out of it this time, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're staying out of it, I think, for a number of reasons. One is that they're distracted with their own internal problems. And secondly, the new regime in Egypt is not particularly friendly towards Hamas, which it sees as an ally of the deposed Muslim Brotherhood. And so Hamas is not in the good graces, unlike 2 years ago, where then President Morsi had a direct line of communication with Hamas. There isn't that counterpart now in Egypt to serve as a go-between. And so, on the one hand, Egyptians are distracted. On the other hand, there really isn't the will to intervene.
Do you believe this sort of new relationship that has emerged between the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas, is that going to survive, or is that going to go away?
I think it'll be very hard from Mahmoud Abbas's domestic political standpoint for him to disavow the reconciliation agreement with Hamas. It was seen as a major accomplishment in an environment where there are very few accomplishments. Certainly, the peace process has been a failure. Everything else that President Abbas has tried to do hasn't worked. The one area that he can claim relative success is in at least attempting to fix the Palestinian house. So I don't think it will be that easy to completely sever what is essentially a very minimal reconciliation agreement to begin with. But it does seem clear that I think that was at least one of the goals of Israel in embarking on this path from the beginning, from the West Bank incursions and the campaign that was carried out over the previous 3 weeks, as well as the air campaign against Gaza. I think one of the major goals was to disrupt, if not completely destroy, the Palestinian Reconciliation Agreement.
I'm going to be speaking shortly with the U.S. ambassador to Israel. What do the Palestinians want the Obama administration to do right now?
Well, I think the most urgent priority for Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, is to see an end to the killing, to see a ceasefire, and at that point, then a political process maybe can be underway. I think one of the problems with the approaches to Gaza, both by Israel and the United States, has been that there's a tendency to treat Gaza as though it were a separate and distinct conflict from the overall Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That there's something called a Hamas-Israel conflict, and then there's, the conflict with the Palestinian Authority, in which they engage in negotiations. The reality is that Gaza is part of the same conflict, and trying to deal with it separately, I think, is one of the reasons why we're in this mess on a recurring basis. We've seen this before over and over. It's the 7th major military operation by Israel in 9 years, and it clearly suggests that the approach to Gaza is simply not working. And I think the underlying mistake is to try and somehow deal with Gaza as though it were separate from the rest of the Palestinian-Israeli equation. And part of the problem is that there hasn't been a unified Palestinian leadership, and we ought to be supporting that.
Khalid El-Gindi, thanks very much for joining us. A good, important insight from you. We'll certainly have you back. Appreciate it very much.